The crack in the limestone was maybe 14 inches wide, and the old man was trying to squeeze his shoulders into it. His dog was already down inside, barking in a way the old man had learned over 32 years meant one thing. Somebody was down there. Silas pushed his hat off, exhaled every bit of air out of his chest, and jammed his shoulder past the lip of the crack. Sharp rock tore his shirt. His ribs scraped stone. He got wedged for a bad half-second and thought, this is where a stupid old man gets stuck in a rock and dies. Then his shoulder popped through, and he slid 4 feet straight down into the dark. Below him, Buck was still barking. Silas Harrow was 71 years old, alone, no cell signal. He had no idea what his dog had found. Stay with me on this one. Let me tell you who Silas Harrow was before that afternoon. Silas was 71, and he lived in a little bunkhouse on 40 acres of West Texas scrubland that had belonged to his wife's family before he ever met her. His wife Ellen had died for years back, cancer, ugly and slow. They'd been married 42 years. She was buried on the ridge behind the house under the mesquite tree they'd both loved, and Silas walked up there every morning with his coffee and told her about the day ahead. He didn't think it was crazy. It was the closest thing he had to church anymore. Silas had been a lot of things. Marine Corps, 2 tours in Vietnam. He'd come home in 72 with a limp he still had and a habit of not sleeping. Then he'd trained dogs for the Army for 8 years, and then he'd retired out and started a small kennel of his own. And then Ellen's father had gotten sick, and they'd moved out to the land to help, and they'd stayed. For 32 years after that, Silas had trained search and rescue dogs for county sheriffs across 6 states. He deployed with those dogs personally, more times than he could count, into flooded rivers and collapsed buildings and lost child woods. He'd pulled 23 people out of places they would have died in without him. He'd stopped counting the bodies. There were more of those than the live finds. There always are, in that work. He'd trained his last dog 5 years ago. Then Ellen had gotten her diagnosis, and Silas had stopped everything to sit with her, and after she died he did not have the heart to start up again. The kennel stood empty. The training field grew weeds. Silas had figured he was done. He was too old, and he was too tired, and there was nobody left he needed to keep working for. Then there was Buck. Buck was the last dog Silas had ever trained. He was a German Shepherd, black and tan, and he was 9 years old now, which is late middle age for a working dog. Silas had kept him. Not because he'd ever meant to. Buck had just never left. He slept on the foot of Silas's bed. He rode shotgun in the old Chevy. He walked the ridge with Silas every morning and sat with him while Silas talked to Ellen. Buck knew every command Silas had ever taught him, and he still worked scent when Silas laid tracks for him in the afternoons out of pure habit. Buck was the best dog Silas had ever handled. And Buck, in the quiet years since Ellen died, had become the closest thing Silas had left to family in this world. Here's what people who don't work dogs don't understand. A really good working dog is not a pet. A really good working dog is a partner. Silas and Buck had spent 9 years reading each other. Silas could tell you, from 20 feet away, which of 6 different smells Buck had just caught, based on the exact set of the dog's ears. Buck could tell you, from 100 feet away, when Silas was hurting from his hip and needed to sit down. They were, in the way old men and old dogs sometimes are, one thing. That Tuesday afternoon, Silas had loaded Buck into the truck and driven out to a stretch of bluff country about 40 minutes from the house. He wasn't looking for anything. He liked to drive Buck out to different terrain and let the old dog work his nose for the fun of it. It kept Buck young in the way that mattered. It kept Silas young too, though he wouldn't have said that out loud. They'd been out there maybe an hour, walking a caprock ridge above a dry wash, when Buck's whole posture changed. Silas knew that change. He'd seen it 1,000 times. Buck's ears came forward. His tail dropped. His head went down and locked. He'd caught scent, and it wasn't the deer scat Silas had watched him lose interest in 10 minutes ago. This was human. Silas knew before he consciously thought about it. Buck did not alert on human scent for practice. Buck alerted on human scent because he had been trained to save people, and 32 years of training does not turn off. The dog moved off the trail. He took Silas along the base of the limestone bluff, nose down, tail rigid, breathing in the tight patterned way Silas had trained him to. He stopped at a crack in the rock. A hairline crack, wider at the top than the bottom, running back into the bluff at an angle. Buck stood in front of it and gave the alert Silas had personally taught him 30 years ago. 1 bark, 2 barks, sit. 1 bark, 2 barks, sit. Silas came up beside him. He got down on his knees, which hurt his hip, and he put his ear to the crack. He didn't hear anything at first. Then faint, so faint he thought he was imagining it, he heard a sound that he had heard exactly once before in his career, in a collapsed church basement in Louisiana 30 years back. A child crying. Underground. A long way down. Silas Harrow, 71 years old, alone on a bluff with no cell signal, sat back on his heels and closed his eyes. Buck barked again. 1-2 sit. Silas said out loud, "All right, buddy. All right. I hear you." He climbed to his feet. He walked back to the truck. He got his knife, his flashlight, his coil of static rope, his radio which he already knew would not reach anybody from this ridge, and the small first aid kit he'd carried in that truck for 20 years. He came back to the crack. Buck was already down inside it, having simply pushed through where he could, and Silas could hear the dog barking down and away from him, moving deeper into the bluff. Silas Harrow looked at that 14-inch crack in the limestone and thought about his hip, and his 62-year-old collarbone that had never quite healed right, and about how everybody who loved him had told him for years to be careful out here alone. He thought about what a normal 71-year-old man would have done. He'd have walked back to the truck. He'd have driven 40 minutes to somewhere with cell signal. He'd have called it in and let younger men bring proper equipment. Then he thought about a child crying underground while he did that. He took off his hat. He tied it to his belt. He put the flashlight in his teeth. He wedged his shoulder into the crack. That was how a 71-year-old man ended up sliding 4 feet straight down into the dark on the word of a 9-year-old dog. The crack opened up once Silas got past the lip. He landed on a slope of scree in a narrow chamber, maybe 5 feet across at the widest, ceiling 3 feet above his head. Buck was already 15 feet ahead of him, still barking, still working, moving down what turned out to be a natural chimney in the limestone. The floor of the chimney sloped down at maybe 30 degrees, and the air coming up from below was cooler than the air outside, which meant this cave went deep. Silas got his flashlight out of his teeth and put it in his hand, and he started to crawl. Now here's the thing about caving that people don't understand. It is not really about being brave. It is about being small enough and calm enough. Silas was not small anymore, and he was not particularly brave, and he was 71 years old with a bad hip. But he had spent his life in tight spaces after dogs, and he had learned to breathe out, keep his elbows in, and move 6 inches at a time without panic. He crawled. His shirt tore. He scraped both palms bloody in the first 10 feet. Buck kept going ahead of him, then coming back to check on him, then going ahead again, the way a good working dog does. Silas talked to him the whole time. He said, "That's right, buddy. That's right. Slow. Slow. We got time." They did not have time. Silas knew they did not have time. But he knew the value of saying it out loud in a cave. 20 feet in, the chimney bent. Silas had to lie flat on his belly and pull himself around a rib of stone with his fingers hooked into a crack. His flashlight beam bounced off wet limestone. He could hear water dripping somewhere. He could still hear the child crying, closer now but weaker. That was the sound that put fire in his old chest and got him past the bend when his hip locked up and his eyes watered from the pain. 30 feet in, the passage opened up into a small round chamber. Buck was already there, standing at the far side looking down. Silas came up beside him and shone the flashlight down where Buck was looking. There was a drop, maybe 12 feet straight down into a lower chamber. At the bottom of the drop, in a puddle of muddy water, curled up against the rock wall, was a boy. He was maybe 8 years old. He was covered in mud and blood. His clothes were torn. He was awake but barely, and he was crying softly, the way a child cries when he has been crying for days and has nothing left. He looked up when the flashlight hit him. His eyes were huge and hollow. Silas Harrow, 71 years old and 12 feet up in a limestone chamber, said the thing he had said 1,000 times in his career. He said, "Hey there, buddy. My name's Silas. This is my dog Buck. We're gonna get you out of there. Can you tell me your name?" The boy's mouth moved. It took him 3 tries to get sound out. He whispered, "Ethan." Silas said, "Ethan. How old are you?" Ethan whispered, 8. Silas said, "Are you hurt anywhere?" Ethan said, "My leg." Silas ran the flashlight down over the boy. He saw it. The right leg was bent wrong below the knee. Broken, not compound, but bad. The boy had been trapped down there with a broken leg for 6 days. Later, when the rescue teams reconstructed it, they figured out what had happened. Ethan Reyes had gone missing from his family's ranch, 16 miles south of that bluff, 6 days earlier. There had been an Amber Alert. 6 counties had searched. His parents had been on the news every night. But Ethan Reyes had not been anywhere near his family's ranch. Ethan Reyes had been out in the bluff country with his uncle for what was supposed to be an afternoon of exploring the caves his uncle knew about from his own boyhood. Ethan's uncle, a man named Ray Reyes, had brought him out there without telling anybody. And Ethan's uncle, who had been drinking, had let the boy climb into a crack he shouldn't have. When Ethan had fallen 12 feet and landed on his leg, Ray Reyes had panicked. He had climbed down to the boy, tried to lift him, hurt him worse, understood he could not get the boy back up without help, and then Ray Reyes had done the thing that would ruin his life. He had climbed out. He had gone home. He had told no one. He had let his sister and her husband go through 6 days of national television believing their son had wandered off in the woods, while their son lay in a cave with a broken leg getting slowly weaker. Silas didn't know any of that yet. What Silas knew kneeling in a limestone chamber 12 feet above a dying child, was that he could not lift a boy with a broken leg out of a passage he himself had barely fit through. Not alone. Not at 71. He needed help. He needed to leave the boy long enough to go get it. That was, Silas said later, the hardest thing he had ever done in his life. He unclipped his coil of rope. He tied one end around a rock horn he could see at the top of the drop, and he lowered himself down into the lower chamber where the boy was. He gave the boy the last 2 granola bars from his pocket and the water bottle off his belt, and his own jacket, which was still warm. He checked the boy's pulse. He checked the leg without moving it. He put his hand on the boy's forehead the way he had learned to a lifetime ago, and he said, "Ethan, listen to me. I have to leave you here for a little while. I am going to bring back help. I promise you, on everything I have ever loved in this life, I will come back. Buck is going to stay right up there. You'll be able to hear him. He will not leave you. Do you understand me?" Ethan nodded, Tiny. Silas said, "Tell me you understand." Ethan whispered, "You'll come back." Silas said, "I will come back." He kissed the top of the boy's mud-covered head. Then Silas Harrow, 71 years old with his shoulders shaking from something that was not the cold, climbed his own rope back up out of that lower chamber, sat Buck at the top of the drop with a command Buck had known for 9 years, and started the long crawl back to the surface alone. Buck did not follow him. Buck stayed, because Silas had told him to stay, and there was not a force on earth that would have made Buck leave that little boy now. Silas came out of that crack into the late afternoon sun, looking like a man who had crawled through a war. His forearms were bleeding. His shirt was torn to strips. His hip was on fire. He drove down that ridge road faster than his old truck had any business going, and when he finally got a bar of cell signal on the highway, he did not call the sheriff. He called something better. He called the county search and rescue coordinator, a woman named Dana Rivers, whom Silas had helped train 19 years ago, and who had spent her whole adult career pulling people out of hard places because a 71-year-old man had once told her she could. Dana answered on the second ring. Silas said, "Dana. Ethan Reyes. I have him. Alive. In a bluff cave 16 miles north of his ranch. Broken leg. Buck is with him. I need a full technical team out here in the next hour, or I lose him. I am 40 minutes back to him, and I am not calling anybody else because we don't have time." Dana Rivers had a full technical rescue team in the air out of Midland inside 20 minutes. If you're still with me this far, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Stories like this one only reach people because folks like you stay till the end. It means more than you know. Silas turned the truck around and drove back to the bluff. He crawled back into the crack. His hip was worse now. His shoulder was worse. But he got back down through the chimney to the boy, and Buck met him at the drop, and Silas lowered himself back into the lower chamber, and lay down on the wet rock beside Ethan Reyes, and held the boy's small cold hand until the sound of helicopter rotors came thumping over the bluff outside. The rescue took 4 hours. It took a technical team of 8 people, and a rock drill, and a widened access shaft cut through the top of the chimney. It took Dana Rivers on ropes personally, doing the handoff with Silas at the bottom, because Dana had said on the radio that she was going to be the one to bring that boy up, and nobody was going to tell her different. It took Buck being lifted out in a canvas sling, calm as a queen, because Buck had done his job and knew it. And it took Silas Harrow, at the very end, being helped out of the crack by 2 paramedics who kept saying, "Sir, please stop moving. Please let us do this," because Silas had crawled the last 10 feet on his own, and would not be carried through a hole he had crawled into himself. They loaded Ethan into the helicopter. He was flown to a children's hospital in Lubbock. He would spend 3 weeks in that hospital, but he would live, and his leg would heal, and he would grow up. His parents were at that hospital when the helicopter landed. Silas was not there for that reunion. He was still sitting on a rock at the top of a bluff with a foil blanket around his shoulders while a paramedic tried to bandage his forearms, and while a 9-year-old German shepherd sat pressed against his good hip. Silas had not cried on the way out of the cave. He did not cry when the paramedic told him the boy was in stable condition. He cried when Buck put his head in Silas's lap and looked up at him, and Silas leaned down and pressed his forehead to the dog's forehead, and stayed there a long time. Now, what happened after that changed things for a lot of people. Because when Ethan Reyes woke up in that hospital, sedated and safe, the very first thing he said, before anything else, was, "Uncle Ray left me down there." The sheriff sat down with the boy the next morning. He got the whole story in pieces over hours. About the trip his uncle had never told anyone about. About the fall. About Ray Reyes climbing out and never coming back. About 6 days alone in the dark. Ray Reyes was arrested that afternoon. The whole state of Texas learned in one long news cycle that a missing child had not wandered off, but had been left in a cave for 6 days by an uncle who had made a decision that was going to cost that uncle everything he had. The charges were serious. Child endangerment, reckless abandonment, obstruction. The county DA would eventually add attempted homicide by omission, and it would stick. Ethan Reyes's parents were destroyed in a different way now. Not by loss, but by betrayal. Their own brother. Their own family. The family broke, publicly, ugly, on the front pages of every paper in West Texas. Ray Reyes went to prison. His wife left him. The Reyes family did not go to Thanksgiving that year, or the next one, or the one after that. Sometimes the truth of a thing costs you more than the mystery of it did. But Ethan Reyes was alive. That was the piece that mattered. Ethan Reyes was going to grow up. And Ethan Reyes, whenever anybody asked him, would tell them the same three names in the same order for the rest of his life. Silas Harrow. Buck. Dana Rivers. The story that came out over the next months in that trial was worse than the county wanted to know. Ray Reyes had been drinking for years, quietly, in the way rural men do when nobody around them is willing to call it what it is. He had lost 2 jobs to it. His own wife had, on more than one occasion, refused to let him take her children anywhere in a car. But Ray Reyes had been charming and family, and Ethan's mother Marta had believed her older brother when he said he was clean now, and she had let her son ride out into the country with an uncle who had a bottle in the glove box the whole time. In the trial, Marta Reyes sat in the front row every single day, and she did not miss 1 hour, and she looked at her brother across a courtroom the way people look at somebody they have understood, finally, is a stranger. When the verdict came in, guilty on every count, she did not react. She walked out of that courtroom and drove home to her son and sat on the edge of his bed while he did his homework and did not tell him what had happened, because Ethan had already had enough of what had happened. The family did break. Not just Marta and her brother, but the whole extended web of it, aunts and cousins and grandparents, everybody who had watched Ray and looked away for years. Some sided with him. Most did not. There were funerals over the following decade where certain relatives did not attend because other relatives were there. That was the shape of what one afternoon in a cave had done. Not to Ethan. To the family around him. Dana Rivers deserves her own piece of this story, because she was the one who got the technical team there in time, and because the arc of her career runs straight through Silas Harrow's old training field. Dana had come to Silas when she was 21, right out of a paramedic program, and she had told him she wanted to work search dogs. She had been the only woman in her class of applicants, and she had been small, 5'3", and Silas had looked her over with the frank, tired eyes of a man who had trained 29 handlers before her and asked her exactly one question. He had asked her why. And Dana Rivers had said, "Sir, because I lost my little brother in a swimming hole when I was 9, and it took them 40 hours to find him. And I have decided the world does not need to be like that anymore." Silas had said, "All right, come Monday." He had trained her for 4 years. He had been brutal with her, in the way he had been brutal with every handler, because bad handlers get people killed. Dana had cried at his kitchen table more than once. She had also, at the end of those 4 years, been one of the finest working handlers in 3 states. She had run search and rescue for the county from age 28 onward. When Silas called her from the highway that Tuesday afternoon, she had known before the second word out of his mouth that he was not messing around. 19 years of trust ran in one direction the moment she picked up. That was why the helicopter was in the air inside 20 minutes. That was why Ethan Reyes came out of that cave alive. Dana would later say that the moment on the radio was the proudest moment of her career, and that it was not because of what she did that afternoon. It was because Silas Harrow, at 71, alone in a bluff country with a child dying below him, had called her. Out of every person he could have called, he had called her. She had spent her whole adult life becoming somebody Silas would call first. That was the whole story of Dana Rivers, and she owed it to a man in a torn shirt on a truck bed drinking bad coffee. Silas didn't want the news coverage. He hated it. He was 71 years old, and he had spent his whole life quietly, and he had no use, at his age, for cameras on his front porch. But the story had gotten too big to hide from, and eventually Silas gave one short interview, on his own porch, with Buck at his feet. He said what he always said. He said, "Ma'am, I didn't do that. My dog did that. If Buck doesn't alert on that crack, I walk right past it. Whatever anybody says about me, they need to say it about him." He said it with his hand on the dog's head, and Buck sat there for the whole interview looking dignified and slightly bored, the way old working dogs look when they know they've done the thing they were made for. The town wanted to give him something. Silas didn't want it. What he agreed to, eventually, was that they would take the money people had been sending, and they would use it to reopen the kennel training program on his land, funded fully, so that other young handlers could train dogs the way Silas had trained his. Silas would teach. He didn't want to run it, but he would teach. He did teach. For 8 more years he taught. Every Saturday, all day, a rotating class of 6 young men and women who wanted to work search dogs, sitting on hay bales in his old training field, listening to a 71-year-old Marine explain how a really good dog reads the wind. Dana Rivers helped him run the program. Ethan Reyes's parents helped fund it. Ethan himself came out to the ranch every summer for a week. He was quiet and thoughtful, and he loved Buck like Buck was his own, and Buck, who was old now and slow, loved him back. Ethan brought his own son out later, when he had won, and named that boy Silas. Silas Harrow lived to be 79 years old. He died in his sleep in his own bed, at his own ranch, with Buck's grandson at the foot of the bed, and he was buried on the ridge behind the house next to Ellen, under the mesquite tree they had both loved. Dana Rivers gave the eulogy. She was the county search and rescue chief by then, and she had, over her career, personally saved 41 people. She said at the graveside that all of them, every single one, had been saved partly by a man in the ground in front of her, and by his dogs, and by an unbroken thread of training and love that went back to when she was 21 years old and Silas Harrow told her she could do this work. Buck outlived Silas by 10 months. He was old and sad, and he mostly slept. Dana took him. She said he was too old to work, but too smart to leave. He died on her front porch in the sun. She buried him on the ridge next to Silas. The training program is still running. There are search and rescue dogs working right now in 11 states that trace their handler lineage back to that little kennel on the West Texas ranch. Ethan Reyes runs a nonprofit that funds it. The nonprofit is called 42 Feet. Nobody has to explain the name to the people who know. Silas Harrow died believing his best days had ended when Ellen died. He was wrong about that. His best days were the ones when he was 71, and his hip hurt, and his dog dragged him to a crack in a rock, and he squeezed himself into a hole he was too old to squeeze into, because a child was crying underground, and there was nobody else who was going to come. Sometimes the man everybody thinks is finished is the only one who isn't. Sometimes the dog knows first. And sometimes an old veteran with a 9-year-old shepherd is the answer to a prayer that a little boy in the dark has been whispering for 6 days straight. Ethan Reyes is a grown man now. He teaches middle school science in a small town not far from where his uncle used to live. He walks with a very slight limp that his students never notice. He takes his own kids camping. He has never told them the whole story of the cave because they are still young, but he will tell them when they are old enough. He wants them to understand that when a good dog barks in a quiet place, somebody who loves you comes. He still says the same 3 names, in the same order, whenever he tells the story.